Chapter 6, Part 1 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1 by John Bagnell Berry. Chapter 6, Part 1. While the Greeks were sailing their own seas and working out in their city-states the institutions of law and freedom, untroubled by any catastrophe beyond the shores of the Mediterranean, great despotic kingdoms were waxing and waning in the east. In the 7th century, the mighty empire of Assyria was verging to its end. The power destined to overthrow it had arisen. But the story of Assyria lies outside the story of Greece, since the Greeks, except in one outlying corner, came into no immediate contact with the lords of Nineveh. The Greeks, as well as the Phoenician communities of Cyprus, were involved in the fortunes of the Syrian coastland. When, in the last quarter of the 8th century, Sargon, under whose scepter Assyria reached the summit of her power, had conquered the lands of the sea-coast, the Phoenicians and the Philistines, 7 kings who lived at a distance of 7 days in the middle of the Western Sea, trembled before him and offered their submission. They were the kings of Yatnan, as the Assyrians called Cyprus, and their act of fealty is recorded for us by Sargon himself on a pillar which he set up in a valley of the land of Yatnan. Among the monarchs who submitted there were doubtless Greeks as well as Phoenicians, and a generation later we had the names of 10 Cypriot kings who were subject to Esarhaddon and to Ashurbanipal. Ashurhaddon, the great conqueror who voluntarily abdicated his throne, and Assurbanipal, the peace sovereign, whom the Greeks remembered as Sardanapalus. Among the names of the vassals whom inscriptions of these 2 kings enumerate are those of Eteandros of Paphos and Pelagoras of Kition. But if the story of Assyria touches only a remote fringe of the Hellenic world, it is otherwise with the story of those who destroyed the Assyrian Empire. The Medes and Persians, folks of Aryan speech like the Greeks, were marked out by destiny to be the adversaries of the Greeks throughout the 2 chief centuries of Grecian history. The land of Media lies east of Assyria. Its ancient history is shrouded in mist, but there are some reasons for guessing that in the 2nd millennium it was part of the great Aryan kingdom, which stretched far northeastwards over the plains of Bactria, peopled by the Iranian branch, as it is called, of the Aryan stock. The Iranians worshipped the same gods of heaven and light as the other folks of their kindred, but their sun worship developed into a very different shape from religion of Zeus. They regarded the element of fire with deeper reverence than other sun worshippers. They dreaded to pollute it by the touch of a dead body or the overflow of boiling water. Their land was full of temples with altars of perpetual fire. But the religion of the fire worshippers had been moulded into an almost philosophical form by their prophet Zoroaster, who, though his name is encompassed with legend, and it is uncertain when he lived, was assuredly a real man and not a creation of myth. He diffused among the Iranians the doctrine that the world is the perpetual scene of a deadly strife between the powers of light and darkness, between Ormuzd, the great lord, and Ahriman, the principle of evil. It was towards the end of the 8th century that the Medes rebelled against the yoke of Assyria. They were led by Deioces, and after a struggle Media gained her independence, and the deliverer was elected king by the free vote of his people. He had not only freed, but had united his countrymen, and he set the seal on the union of Media by building the great city of Ecbatana. His treasury and palace were in the centre of a fortress girdled by 7 walls, and he is said to have lived in this stronghold, withdrawn from the sight of his people, who would approach him only by written petitions. The first successor of Deioces had enough to do in resisting the efforts of Assyria to recover her power over Media, but presently a king arose who was strong enough to extend his sway beyond the borders of his own land. Phraortes conquered the hilly land of Persia in the south, and thus a large Aryan realm was formed stretching from the Caspian to the Persian Gulf, east of Assyria and Babylonia. The next step was to conquer Assyria itself, and Cyaxares, the successor of Phraortes, prepared for the enterprise by a new organization of the Median army. It was no hopeless task, for the Assyrian Empire had been breaking up. Egypt had thrown off the yoke of the kings of Nineveh, and Nabopolassar had just risen to do for Babylonia what Deioces had done for Media. Nabopolassar and Cyaxares joined hands, and the united forces of Media and Babylonia defeated the Assyrian army. The conquerors divided the empire. The southwestern portion up to the borders of Egypt went to Babylonia. Assyria itself and the land stretching westward into Asia Minor were annexed to Media. The restored kingdom of Babylonia, under Nebuchadnezzar, the successor of its founder, rose into wonderful fame and brilliance. He drove the Egyptians out of Syria, smiting them in the great battle of Carchemish. He stormed Jerusalem and carried the Jews into captivity. He made Tyre on its rock tremble, though he failed to take it. He invaded and overran Egypt. But more famous than in conquests abroad were his mighty works in his own land. He made Babylon the greatest city in the world, and the stray Greeks who visited it came back with amazing stories of the palaces and temples, and the hanging gardens, a terraced park which was constructed by Nebuchadnezzar. The report ascribed it to the mythical queen Semiramis. But the gigantic walls which girt the city were the mightiest monument of Nebuchadnezzar. Greek travellers said the circuit was more than 50 miles. It seems certain that few men have done more than this lord of Babylon to increase the sum of human misery. If we imagine the lives of countless thralls forced under the pitiless lash to spend their flesh and blood in unceasing and unsparing labour. Nebuchadnezzar went down to his grave full of honours after a long reign. He knew well on what side danger was to be feared for his kingdom. One of his works of fortification was a wall from the Tigris to the Euphrates, north of Babylon, to defend Babylonia against Media, her northern neighbour. The exploits of the great Babylonian king affected Greece little. The Greeks of Cyprus must have caught the echoes of the clash of arms at Carchemish. They must have been stirred by the tidings of the storming of Jerusalem, and excited by the siege of Tyre. But the changes which had befallen the east were brought nearer to the ken of Greece by the advance of Media. Cyaxares drew under his power the eastern parts of Asia Minor as far as the banks of Halys, and this river became the boundary between Media and Lydia. The conquest of Lydia was the next aim in the expansion of the Median power, and a pretext was found for declaring war. In the 6th year of the war, a battle was fought. But in the midst of the combat, the day was turned suddenly to night, and the darkening of the sun made such a deep impression on the minds of the combatants that they laid down their arms, and the peace was concluded. But the solar obscuration of this May day has another association which has a deeper interest for Europe than the warfare of the Lydian and Mede. It was the first eclipse of which European science foretold when it should betide. Thales of Miletus, the father of Greek and therefore of European philosophy and science, had studied astronomy in Egypt, and he was able to warn the Ionians that before such a year had passed, his law could not tell the day or the hour, the sun would be darkened. Thales was not only the first man of science, he was also the first philosopher. Science and philosophy were not yet separated. If he looks over the ages of Copernicus, Newton, and Laplace, he looks likewise to Descartes, Berkeley, and Kant. He sought for a common substance, a single principle which should explain the variety of nature and reduce the world to unity and system. It is a small matter that he found this principle in water. It is his eternal merit to have sought it. The Lydian king Aleates wedded his daughter to Astyages, who succeeded to the throne of Media, and the kingdom of Lydia was saved for a generation to enjoy the most brilliant period of its history. When Lydia recovered from the Cimmerian invasion, King Ardus renewed the efforts of Gyges to reduce the Greek cities of the coast. His chief success seems to have been the capture of Priene. His successors, Sadiates and Aleates, carried on a wary war against Miletus. They harried the Milesian territory every year, destroying the corn crops, and defeated the Milesians in 2 battles, but the strong walls of the coast city defied them, as they had no fleet. At length Aleates made peace with Miletus. Possibly it was the outbreak of the war with Media that forced him to this step. At all events, he seemed to have behaved liberally to his foes. He built 2 temples to Athena, in the place of one which had been burned down when he was devastating the Milesian land. This act of reparation was quite in accordance with the reverence for the gods of Greece, which the Lydian monarchs invariably displayed. The story is that when Aleates fell ill and consulted Apollo at Delphi, the oracle enjoined him to restore the temple. Ionian Miletus was saved, but the famous Achaean city of Smyrna was not only captured but destroyed, and in this volume its name will occur no more. Aleates also conquered Bithynia, and drove out the remnant of the Cimmerians out of Asia. He might think that Lydia would now take rank with one of the great monarchies of the south or the east, and he built himself an enormous sepulchre, an earth mound on stone foundations, which in size at least might match the monuments of Egyptian or Babylonian kings. It was reserved for Croesus, the son of Aleates, to carry out fully the design of subjugating the cities of eastern Greece. He attacked and subdued the cities, Ionian and Aeolian, one after another, all except Miletus, whose treaty with his father he respected, while Miletus on her part saved her freedom by withholding all help from her sister cities. The Dorian states of Caria also forced to submit, and the empire of Croesus extended from the Halys to the Aegean. We saw before that Lydia exercised a distinct influence on the Greeks of Asia, but perhaps their influence upon her was even greater. The Greek language spread in Lydia, and we may well suspect that it was heard in Sardis as much as the native idiom. The Greek gods were revered, the Greek oracles were appealed to. The kings were benefactors of Hellenic sanctuaries. In the new temple of Artemis, which arose at Ephesus during his reign, Croesus was the donor of the sculptured reliefs which encircled the Ionic pillars, and fragments of the 3 words which recorded the gift, dedicated by King Croesus, can still be read on the bases of the columns. Hence the Greeks never regarded the Lydians as utter barbarians, and they always cherished a curious indulgence and sympathy for Croesus, though he had enslaved and ruled as despot the cities of Asiatic Hellas. The court of Sardis was, in truth, more oriental than Hellenic, not only in wealth and luxury, but also in its customs, for instance polygamy, and the infliction of cruel punishments. Croesus carded alive a man who had opposed his succession to the throne. The Ionians had marvelled at the treasures of the golden Gyges, but the untold wealth of Croesus became proverbial. It was furnished largely by the tributes of the Greek cities, as well as by the white gold of Pactolus, and the products of the mines of Pergamon. Croesus was the first to introduce, instead of the white gold money, a coinage of 2 metals, pure gold and silver, bearing to each other the fixed proportions of 3 to 40. There is no more striking proof of the political importance of the oracle of Delphi at this period than the golden offerings dedicated by Croesus, offerings richer than even the priestly avarice of the Delphians could have hoped for. Wealthy though the lord of Lydia was, genuine as was his faith in the inspiration of the oracle, he might hardly have sent such gifts if he had not wished to secure the political support of Apollo, and believed that Apollo's support was worth securing. His object was to naturalize himself as a member of the Greek world, to appear not as an outsider, but as an adopted son of Hellas, ruling over the Greeks whom he had subdued, and those whom he still hoped to subdue. Nothing would be more helpful than the good word of the Delphic oracle to compass such a reputation. Moreover, if one of the Asiatic cities contemplated rebellion, a discouraging reply from the oracle, which would assuredly be consulted, might stand the despot in good stead. Having extended his sway to the coast, Croesus conceived the idea of making Lydia a sea power and conquering the islands. It was a perfectly feasible plan, and it was not till unforeseen events had frustrated it that the islanders could have found much comfort in the epigram that a Lydian king sailing against them with a fleet would be like themselves advancing against Lydia with a host of cavalry. The tale afterwards shaped itself that one of the wise men of Greece, it mattered little whether he was alive at the time or not, used this witticism to dissuade Croesus from the enterprise. But Croesus was diverted from his western designs by something graver than an epigram. Events of great moment were happening in the east. His brother-in-law Astyages was hurled from the throne of Media by a hero, who was to become one of the world's mightiest conquerors. The usurper was Cyrus the Great, of the Persian family of the Achaemenids. The revolution signified indeed little more than a change of dynasty. The Persians and Medes were peoples of the same race and the same faith. The realm remained Iranian as before, but the Persians seemed to have been the noblest part of the Iranian race. Their bravery, temperance, and love of truth extorted the admiration of the Greeks. The fall of Astyages was an opportunity for the ambitious Lydian to turn his arms to the east. The restoration of his brother-in-law was indeed a sufficient plea, and he might have good cause to fear that if he were not the first to strike, the Persian usurper would soon advance to the conquest of Lesser Asia. But Croesus certainly cherished hopes of extending the Lydian power into the interior parts of Asia, if not of succeeding himself to the Median throne. In undertaking such an enterprise, he had to fear his Greek subjects, who might take advantage of his absence to throw off his yoke, and might even intrigue with the Persian. That the Greeks of Ionia had long been accustomed to regard Media as a resort against Lydia, and to intrigue with the Median kings, is shown by the word Medism. For if such intriguing had first come into fashion after the rise of Persia and the fall of Lydia, the names chosen to designate it would naturally have been Persism. The preparations of Croesus for an expedition to the east were welcome news to the lands of the Aegean. Desirous of probing the hidden events of the future, he consulted some of the oracles of Greece. There can be no question that the Delphic god gave him an answer which was meant to encourage him in his enterprise. It is said that the answer was that if he crossed the Halys, he would destroy a mighty empire, an answer which need not have been that which was actually given, but may have been circulated afterwards to justify the oracle when the expedition failed. But it is the policy of the oracle, not its methods of evasion, which has historical significance. The spirit of Delphi was favourable to Hellenic freedom, and it saw in the proposed expedition the probability of a long war with Persia, and a chance for the Eastern Greeks of retaining their independence. It did not foresee the complete conquest of Lydia, and the subjection of the Greeks to a power which was utterly barbarian. The oracle took the occasion, however, to bring about a union between Croesus and the Lacedaemonians, by bidding him seek the aid of the most powerful state of Greece. An alliance was concluded, but led to nothing, and Lacedaemon sent no help. Croesus, at the head of an army, which included a force of Ionian Greeks, crossed the fateful Halys and invaded Cappadocia. He took the ancient city of Pteria, and in its neighbourhood fought an indecisive battle with the host of Medes and Persians which Cyrus had led against him. But the host of Cyrus seems to have been far superior in numbers, and Croesus retired before him into Lydia. Under the walls of the capital the invader won a decisive victory, and after a short siege Sardis was stormed and plundered. The life of Croesus was spared. Cyrus had given strict injunctions that he was on no account to be slain in the struggle of the capture, and the story went that a soldier, not recognizing him, was about to cut him down when the king's son, who had been dumb from birth, suddenly burst out into speech, "O man, slay not Croesus!" This was not the only tale which adorned the fall of the Lydian king. The capture of Sardis was an eventuality of which no one had seriously thought. So great had been the wealth and might of Croesus, so dizzy the height of his power, that none deemed his overthrow possible, and the sheer and sudden fall into nothingness made perhaps a deeper and more abiding impression on the imagination of Hellas than any other historical event. It was the most illustrious example that the Greeks had ever witnessed of their favourite doctrine, that the gods visit with jealousy men who enjoy too great prosperity. And the personality of Croesus himself crept into their sympathies, the admirer of Hellenic art and wisdom, the adorer of Hellenic gods, the generous giver out of his abundant wealth. Never more than for the memory of Croesus did Greece put forth the power of that genius which she possessed in such full measure, of weaving round an event of history tales which have a deep and touching import as lessons for the life of men. Cyrus built a great pyre, so the story is told by Herodotus, and placed thereon Croesus bound in chains, with 14 Lydian boys. And as Croesus was standing on the pile in this extreme pass, there came into his mind a word which Solon had sent to him, that no man could be called happy so long as he was alive. For the Athenian statesman had visited the court of Sardis in his travels. The art of the tale-weaver had no precise regard for the facts of time, and when he had seen the royal treasures and the greatness of the kingdom, Croesus asked him whom he deemed the happiest of men. Solon named some obscure Greeks who were dead, and when the king, unable to hide his wonder and vexation, exclaimed, "Is our royal fortune so poor, O Athenian stranger, that you set private men before me?" the wise Greek had discoursed on the uncertainty of life and the jealousy of the gods. Then Croesus, remembering this, groaned aloud, and called thrice on the name of Solon. But Cyrus heard him call, and bade the interpreters ask him on whom he was calling. For a while Croesus would not speak. Then he said, "One whom I would that all tyrants might meet and converse with." Pressed further, he named Solon the Athenian, and repeated the wise man's words. The pyre was already alight. But when Cyrus heard the answer of his prisoner, he reflected that he too was a man, and he commanded that the fire should be quenched and the victims set free. The flames were already blazing so strong and high that the men could not quench them. Then Croesus cried to Apollo for help, and the god sent clouds into the clear sky, and a tempestuous shower of rain extinguished the fire. Such is the tale as we read it in the history of Herodotus, who may have heard it at Athens, but we can almost see the story in the making, for before the episode of Solon was woven in, the fate of Croesus had been wrought into a legend. The legend is related in a poem of Bacchylides. When the day of doom surprised the king, he would not abide to enjoy the bitterness of bondage, but he raised a pyre before the palace court, and sat him upon thereon with his wife and his weeping daughters. He bade the slippered thrall kindle the timber buildings. The maidens screamed, and stretched their arms to their mother. But as the might of the fire was springing through the wood, Zeus set a sable cloud above it, and quenched the yellow flame. Then Apollo bore the old man with his daughters to the land of the Hyperboreans, to be his abiding place, for his piety's sake, because his gifts to Pytho were greater than all men's gifts. The moral of the tale clearly was, bring gifts to Delphi, and we can hardly doubt that it was originated under Delphic influence. But in the city of Solon, it was transformed by a touch of genius into one of the great stories of the world. As for Croesus, it is certain that his life was spared, and it is possible that he spent his remaining days in Media, unconscious that a mythical association with the famous Athenian lawgiver would be his best assured claim on the memory of future ages. End of Chapter 6, Part 1.